Our story begins in the year 410 CE, when the mighty Roman Empire made a decision that would echo through the ages. Emperor Honorius, faced with barbarian invasions threatening Rome itself, sent a letter to the Romano-British cities that effectively said, "You're on your own." After nearly 4 centuries of Roman rule, Britain was suddenly cut adrift from the empire that had brought roads, cities, law, and order to the island. The withdrawal of Roman legions didn't happen overnight, but by 410, the last Roman soldiers had departed Britain's shores. What they left behind was a power vacuum that would reshape the island forever. The Romano-British population, numbering perhaps 3 to 4 million people, found themselves without the military protection, administrative structure, and economic networks that had sustained their civilization for generations. In the immediate aftermath, local Romano-British leaders attempted to maintain order. Cities like Londinium, Ibericum, and Verulamium tried to continue functioning as they had under Roman rule. But without the legions to protect trade routes and maintain the peace, these urban centers began to decline. The complex Roman economy, dependent on imperial taxation and long-distance trade, started to crumble. Roads fell into disrepair, villa estates were abandoned, and the sophisticated Roman way of life gradually faded from most of Britain. Into this chaos came new players on the historical stage. Across the North Sea, in the lands we now call Denmark, northern Germany, and the Netherlands, Germanic tribes were experiencing their own pressures. Rising sea levels threatened their coastal settlements. Population growth strained their resources, and the collapse of Roman trade networks disrupted their economies. These tribes, the Angles from what is now Denmark, the Saxons from northern Germany, the Jutes from the Jutland Peninsula, began to look westward across the gray waters of the North Sea. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us that the first Anglo-Saxon warriors arrived in Britain around 449 CE. A Romano-British leader named Vortigern invited Saxon mercenaries led by brothers named Hengist and Horsa to help defend against raids from the Picts and Scots. But what began as a military alliance quickly transformed into something far more significant. The Saxon mercenaries soon realized the weakness of post-Roman Britain and sent word back to their homelands, triggering a series of migrations that would continue for over a century. Archaeological evidence reveals gradual settlement rather than wholesale conquest. Anglo-Saxon pottery, jewelry, and burial practices began appearing across eastern and southern England. Some Romano-British communities fled westward to Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany, while others remained and gradually adopted Anglo-Saxon customs, languages, and identities. It's during this turbulent period that the figure of King Arthur emerges in later historical accounts. While the romantic tales of Camelot and the Knights of the Round Table belong to medieval literature, there may have been a historical basis for these legends. Some scholars suggest that Arthur represents a composite of several Romano-British leaders who organized resistance against the Anglo-Saxon advance during the late 5th and early 6th centuries. The Battle of Bodden Hill, mentioned in several early sources, supposedly saw a great victory by British forces over the Anglo-Saxons sometime around 500 CE. This battle may have temporarily halted Anglo-Saxon expansion, giving the Britons a breathing space of perhaps a generation. But whether this victory was won by a leader named Arthur or by other Romano-British commanders remains one of history's great mysteries. What we can say with certainty is that by the mid-6th century, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had established themselves across much of what would become England. By 600 CE, the Anglo-Saxons had established numerous kingdoms, traditionally called the Heptarchy. The most significant were Wessex in the southwest, Mercia in the Midlands, Northumbria in the north, East Anglia in the east, Essex, Sussex, and Kent in the southeast. Each kingdom had its own king, laws, and ambitions, with warfare between them common as rulers sought to expand their territories. Kent, perhaps because of its proximity to the continent and its role as the first major Anglo-Saxon settlement, initially held prominence. King Æthelflæd of Kent, who ruled from around 589 to 616, was the first Anglo-Saxon king to convert to Christianity, and is remembered as one of the most powerful rulers of his age. His court at Canterbury became a center of learning and culture that would influence Anglo-Saxon England for centuries. The Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England began in 596, when Pope Gregory sent Augustine to convert the Anglo-Saxons. Augustine landed in Kent in 597, where King Albert, whose wife was already Christian, welcomed him, and eventually converted. Augustine established his see at Canterbury, which remains the center of English Christianity today. The process wasn't uniform across England. While Augustine's Roman mission succeeded in the south, Celtic Christianity spread from Ireland and Scotland into northern England, creating a religious divide. The differences between Roman and Celtic traditions came to a head at the Synod of Whitby in 664, where King Oswiu of Northumbria chose to follow Roman practices, unifying Anglo-Saxon Christianity under papal authority. The 8th century saw Mercia become the dominant Anglo-Saxon kingdom under King Æthelstan, who ruled from 757 to 796. Æthelstan controlled much of central and southern England and ordered the construction of Aethelstan Dyke, a massive earthwork along the Welsh border. He was the first Anglo-Saxon king to use the title King of the English, and established diplomatic relations with Charlemagne. After Æthelflæd's death, power began shifting to Wessex in the south. The late 8th century brought a terrifying new threat: the Vikings. The first recorded raid occurred in 787, but the attack on Lindisfarne Monastery in 793 truly announced the Viking Age. For 70 years, Viking raids intensified, with no coasts safe from these skilled sailors and fierce warriors. Everything changed in 865 with the arrival of the Great Heathen Army. This massive invasion force, led by legendary figures like Ivar the Boneless, came not to raid, but to conquer and settle. They systematically attacked Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, seizing fortified positions and demanding tribute. East Anglia fell in 869, Northumbria in 867, and by 873, Vikings had established permanent settlements across much of northern and eastern England, creating what became known as the Danelaw. By 871, only Wessex remained independent. Young Prince Alfred inherited a kingdom under siege. His early reign was marked by constant warfare and near defeat. In 878, he was forced to flee to the Somerset marshes, hiding on the island of Aethelstan. But Alfred was more than a warrior. He was a visionary leader who planned not just for survival, but for long-term revival. When Alfred emerged to win the crucial Battle of Edington in 878, he began transforming his kingdom. The Treaty of Wedmore established boundaries with the Vikings and required their leader Guthrum to convert to Christianity. Alfred's military reforms were revolutionary. He reorganized the army, created a system of fortified towns called burhs, and ensured no part of Wessex was more than 20 miles from protection. Alfred's greatest achievements were cultural. Despite learning to read as an adult, he personally translated Latin works into Old English and established schools. He issued comprehensive law codes emphasizing justice and protection of the weak. Under his patronage, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was compiled, creating a continuous record of English history. His economic reforms strengthened currency and encouraged trade. By Alfred's death in 899, Wessex had transformed from a kingdom fighting for survival into the most powerful state in Britain. The society he ruled was hierarchical but dynamic. At the top were kings and their families, followed by aldermen who governed regions, then thanes who held land in exchange for military service. The majority were ceorls, free farmers who worked their own land and had legal rights. Villages were the basic rural units, with sophisticated farming techniques, including heavy plows and three-field crop rotation. Towns were growing as centers of trade and craft production. Edward the Elder, ruling from 899 to 924, proved a worthy successor. Where Alfred defended, Edward attacked, systematically reconquering the southern Danelaw through military campaigns and diplomatic negotiations. His success was aided by his remarkable sister Æthelflæd, who ruled Mercia as the Lady of the Mercians and was one of the most capable military commanders of her age. Together, they created a powerful alliance that the divided Vikings could not match. The reconquest involved integration rather than expulsion. Edward and Æthelflæd allowed Danish settlers to keep their lands while acknowledging West Saxon overlordship. By 918, Edward controlled everything south of the Humber River. With rulers of Scotland and Wales acknowledging his authority, Edward's son Æthelstan, king from 924, completed the unification. He was perhaps the most successful military commander in Anglo-Saxon history and the most internationally recognized English king before 1066. His greatest triumph came at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937. where he defeated a coalition of Vikings, Scots, and Welsh. This victory established Æthelstan as the first true king of England. Controlling territory from the English Channel to the Scottish border, Æthelstan's court rivaled any in Europe, collected manuscripts, patronized scholars, and maintained diplomatic relations from Ireland to Byzantium. His legal codes were sophisticated, and his administration provided a model for medieval kingship. He promoted English saints and oversaw a flowering of Anglo-Saxon art and literature. Most importantly, he created a unified English identity that transcended ethnic boundaries. The England that Æthelstan left behind in 939 was profoundly different from the fragmented post-Roman Britain of 410. It was a unified kingdom with sophisticated systems, prosperous towns and countryside, and rich cultural life. The various peoples, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, and Romano-British, had begun to think of themselves as English rather than as separate ethnic groups. The story of the Anglo-Saxons is ultimately one of transformation and adaptation. Germanic tribes became English kingdoms, pagan warriors became Christian kings, and competing realms became a unified nation. Through 5 centuries of warfare, migration, cultural exchange, and political innovation, the Anglo-Saxons created the foundations of modern England. Their legacy lives on in the English language, which remains fundamentally Germanic despite later influences. Their legal traditions, emphasizing individual rights and rule of law, influenced constitutional government. Their artistic and literary achievements continue to inspire us today. The Anglo-Saxon period reminds us that national identities are created through historical processes of conflict, cooperation, and cultural synthesis. From the ruins of Roman Britain to the unified kingdom of Æthelstan, the Anglo-Saxons created a civilization that became the foundation of one of the world's most influential cultures. Their story is not just ancient history, but the beginning of a national narrative that continues to shape England and the English-speaking world today.